Nepal burns. Not just buildings, but the very trust in its institutions. 72 are dead. Hundreds more wounded. Parliamentary halls charred, courtrooms destroyed, prisons have emptied. This isn't just a protest. This is a national reckoning, a generation rising, saying, you can't keep doing this. In this video, how it escalated, why it matters, for Nepal, and for a world where trust in power is eroding. Stay with me, you're going to see a tale of anger, hope, and what happens when legitimacy is lost. High in the shadows of the Himalayas lies a country of contrasts, Nepal. Known to the world for Mount Everest, spiritual landscapes, and warm hospitality. But beneath this image lies a deeper, messier story. A story of monarchy, revolutions, and an unfinished struggle with democracy. For decades, Nepali politics has been dominated by the same themes: corruption, factional power struggles, and constant shifting of governments. A nation of nearly 30 million people has seen over 20 governments rise and fall in less than 3 decades. Promises made, promises broken, and people left waiting. Imagine being born into that system, into instability as normal. That is the reality for Nepal's youngest generation, Gen Z. They have grown up not with a monarchy, not with civil war, but with democracy on paper. A democracy that too often feels fragile, hijacked, and hollow. In September 2025, this generational tension erupted. And it wasn't just politics as usual. It wasn't another elite reshuffle or parliamentary drama. It was raw, angry, and led by the youth themselves. They took to the streets. They refused to be silenced. They demanded something their parents could not secure: accountability, justice, a future not crippled by corruption. What began as peaceful demonstrations morphed into one of the most destructive uprisings in Nepal's modern history. Government buildings burned, courts destroyed, prisons emptied, lives lost. This is the story of Nepal's Gen Z revolution, a story that raises urgent questions not just for Nepal, but for every fragile democracy across the globe. What happens when the youngest generation, digital natives connected to the world, decide that enough is enough? Every movement has its spark. Sometimes it's a single injustice. Sometimes it's years of anger waiting for a match. In Nepal, the match was lit in September 2025. For years, frustration had been simmering beneath the surface. Ordinary people watched as politicians swapped chairs, made backroom deals, and enriched themselves. Scandals piled up. Promises of reform came and went. Nothing changed. And for the youth, the so-called digital generation, this wasn't just politics. It was their future being stolen. They saw corruption not as headlines, but as barriers to jobs, education, opportunity. Then came a moment, a tipping point. What began as scattered demonstrations against corruption swelled into a national movement. The protests weren't led by old party bosses, nor career activists, but by Gen Z themselves. Students, young workers, children of democracy who had grown tired of its failures. They poured into the streets, chanting slogans, waving signs, their voices amplified by social media. Platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and X, formerly Twitter, carried their message far beyond Kathmandu. "We want accountability," they shouted. "We want justice." But the government's response was brutal. Security forces moved in with tear gas, batons, and bullets. What could have been dialogue turned into confrontation. And confrontation turned into tragedy. In just 48 hours, at least 72 people lay dead. Hundreds more were injured. Families carried bodies wrapped in cloth, their grief filling the air. The anger only deepened. Protesters, once determined to march peacefully, watched their friends fall. The spark of frustration had ignited into a fire of rage. Crowds stormed government buildings. Flames consumed parliament halls, courts, even a newly built luxury hotel. Symbols of privilege and corruption burned in the night sky. It was chaos, yes, but also a message. A generation was screaming, "You cannot ignore us any longer." And perhaps the most shocking blow, prisons thrown open, more than 12,000 inmates released into the streets. Law and order itself seemed to collapse. Nepal had crossed a line from protest to uprising. What began as one spark had become a firestorm. And the world was suddenly watching. What makes an uprising unforgettable isn't only the protests themselves, but the destruction left behind. And in Nepal, September 2025 left scars that will take years, maybe decades, to heal. The damage was not just visible, it was monumental. Entire government buildings reduced to charred shells. The nation's Supreme Court, once the symbol of justice, blackened by fire. Inside, decades of files, court records, legal documents gone. Ashes and waterlogged scraps were all that remained. Parliament, too, was set ablaze. The halls where leaders debated laws and policies were filled not with voices, but with smoke. For many Nepalis, it felt symbolic. A broken system, literally burning before their eyes. But it didn't stop there. Fires spread to police stations, district offices, and municipal halls. Nearly every branch of authority, the very structures that represented state power, were targeted. The cost? Staggering. Local economists estimate damage in the billions of rupees, hundreds of millions of US dollars. Entire sectors brought to a halt. Justice, governance, public administration, even tourism. A newly built Hilton hotel in Kathmandu, a symbol of modernization and foreign investment, was gutted. For the business community, it was a chilling reminder that even private enterprise could not escape the fury. And then, the prisons. In scenes that shocked the nation, more than 12,000 inmates escaped as facilities were stormed and gates forced open. The streets of Kathmandu, Pokhara, Biratnagar suddenly flooded with men once behind bars. Murderers, thieves, and political prisoners alike, mixing with protesters. Overnight, law and order seemed to collapse. Families locked their doors. Shops pulled down shutters. An uneasy silence settled over entire neighborhoods as fear replaced anger. Beyond the material damage lay a psychological one. Media outlets were looted. Newsrooms torched. Radio towers knocked offline. In the chaos, reliable information vanished. Whispers, rumors, and viral posts filled the void, each more alarming than the last. People didn't know who to trust, the government, the media, or even their own neighbors. And for ordinary citizens, daily life changed instantly. Court cases frozen. Hospitals overwhelmed. Roads blocked by debris. Students unable to attend school. The very rhythms of normal life shattered. But perhaps the greatest damage was symbolic, the burning of institutions. For many, watching the Parliament and the Supreme Court in flames wasn't just about buildings. It was about the collapse of legitimacy. If these halls of power could not be protected, what did that say about the state itself? In 2 days, Nepal lost more than property. It lost a measure of trust, a sense of order, and a belief in stability. And those losses, unlike buildings, are far harder to rebuild. Numbers can be tallied. Damage can be estimated. But no statistic captures the weight of human loss. In just 48 hours, 72 people were killed. They were not politicians or generals. They were students, shopkeepers, workers, sons and daughters. Some were there by choice, marching for justice. Others were bystanders, caught in the crossfire of chaos. Each life lost left behind a family shattered. In Kathmandu, at the holy site of Pashupatinath, funeral pyres burned one after another. Mothers clutched photographs of their children. Fathers held the national flag over coffins. The air was thick with incense, smoke, and grief. One mother's voice broke through the silence. He said he wouldn't join the protests. He just wanted to see what was happening. But they killed him. Her words captured the tragedy of so many families. Lives cut short not because of crime, but because of a broken system unable to protect its citizens. The hospitals told another story of pain. Emergency wards were overflowing. Young men with gunshot wounds. Children coughing from tear gas exposure. Nurses working with limited supplies. Doctors operating in hallways lit by generators. Outside, families waited anxiously, unsure if their loved ones would survive. And the trauma wasn't just physical. Survivors spoke of nightmares, of hearing gunfire in their sleep, of replaying the moment when crowds scattered and friends fell. Trauma etched itself into the collective memory of an entire generation. Journalists, too, became targets. Newsrooms were looted. Reporters beaten. For many, telling the truth became life-threatening. And yet, Brave voices still tried to share what they saw, armed only with cameras, microphones, and a determination not to be silenced. Then there were the prisoners. Over 12,000 released in the chaos. For victims of crime, the thought was terrifying. Imagine knowing that the man who once attacked you, once stole from you, is now free, walking the same streets. Anxiety spread like wildfire. Neighborhoods organized watch patrols. Families bolted their doors. The uprising had created not just anger, but fear. Ordinary life collapsed under the weight of grief. Schools closed. Shops shuttered. Streets once full of vendors and laughter now echoed with silence. For many Nepalis, the sense of safety, already fragile, was gone. The toll wasn't only national. It was generational. Nepal's youth had marched for accountability. Instead, they buried their friends. They saw institutions fail, leaders absent, and justice delayed. The scars of this uprising will shape how this generation views politics forever. And yet, amid the grief, there was resilience. Families demanded justice. Protesters carried photos of the dead through the streets, vowing their deaths would not be in vain. Communities lit candles in silent vigils. Grief had transformed into determination. The human cost of Nepal's uprising is not measured in numbers. It's measured in tears, in silence, in the empty chairs at dinner tables. It's a cost too heavy for one nation to bear alone. But for Nepal, there is no choice. It is the reality of a country that has lost so much and still must find a way forward. To understand Nepal's uprising, we need to understand the generation at its heart, Gen Z. Born between the mid-1990s and early 2010s, Nepal's Gen Z is unlike any generation before it. They grew up not under monarchy, not during civil war, but in a fragile democracy. A democracy promised to them by their parents, who fought for a republic in 2006. But what did Gen Z inherit? Corruption, stalled reforms, leaders clinging to power, jobs that never arrived, education that costs more than it delivers, and an economy where opportunities at home are so scarce that nearly 2 million Nepalis work abroad just to survive. This generation is young, connected, and global. The median age in Nepal is just 24. Half of the nation is under 30. These young people don't just consume TikToks and Instagram Reels. They use them as weapons. Tools to mobilize, organize, and spread messages faster than governments can censor them. When they looked at their country, they saw something clear, a system stacked against them. They saw politicians trading favors while graduates struggled to find work. They saw justice delayed while corruption cases collected dust. They saw elites living in luxury while families sold land to send children abroad for basic jobs. And so Gen Z demanded change. Not just cosmetic change. Not another new face in the same broken system. Real change. Their demands echoed through chants and posts. Accountability for corruption. Transparency in government. An end to political impunity. A media free from intimidation. A justice system that protects ordinary citizens, not just the powerful. For them, democracy is not just about voting every few years. It's about whether those votes matter. Whether leaders answer to the people or hide behind privilege. Gen Z's movement is also about identity. This is the first generation raised in a world of global connection. They watch youth movements from Hong Kong, Chile, and the United States. They share hashtags with climate activists in Europe and corruption protesters in Africa. They feel part of something larger, a global generation demanding accountability. And they are unafraid to confront authority. Where older generations often compromised, Gen Z refuses. They see silence as betrayal. In their eyes, shouting in the streets is the only language the powerful understand. But their strength is also their vulnerability. Without clear leadership, without a single party or figurehead, the movement is powerful yet fragile. It is united by anger, but its future depends on whether that anger can transform into lasting reform. Still, one thing is certain. Nepal's Gen Z has announced itself. Loudly, visibly, unforgettably. They are no longer the future of the country. They are its present, and they will no longer be ignored. When the smoke cleared and the fires dimmed, Nepal was left with more than ruins. It was left with a political vacuum. The uprising had not only destroyed buildings, it had shaken the very foundation of the state. The prime minister at the time, already unpopular, faced overwhelming calls to resign. And in the middle of the storm, the country turned to an unlikely figure, Sushila Karki. A former chief justice, Karki became Nepal's interim prime minister, the first woman to step into this role in such a crisis. For many, her appointment was symbolic, a woman of law and integrity tasked with restoring order where politics had failed. But her mandate was as daunting as it was historic. She had to do three things at once: calm the violence, rebuild institutions, and prepare for national elections set for March 5, 2026. Three missions, each nearly impossible in a country still reeling from bloodshed. The challenge was not just about bricks and mortar. How do you rebuild the Supreme Court when its archives have turned to ash? How do you restore faith in the parliament when people literally watched it burn? How do you rebuild trust in leaders when 72 citizens lie dead and no one has yet been held accountable? The interim government tried to project strength. Curfews were announced. Military patrols increased in major cities. Officials promised investigations. But many citizens saw these steps as too little, too late. Political parties, meanwhile, began maneuvering for the upcoming elections. Old rivalries re-emerged. Some leaders condemned the violence, while others tried to ride the wave of public anger to gain influence. The streets demanded unity, but the political class seemed stuck in the same old game. And hanging over it all was the question of legitimacy. When a generation believes the system has failed them, can elections alone restore trust? Or is something deeper required? Structural reforms, accountability, and justice. For Sushila Karki, the stakes could not be higher. If she succeeds, Nepal could stabilize, hold credible elections, and begin to heal. If she fails, the country risks sliding into deeper unrest, maybe even a return to authoritarian tendencies. The world is watching closely. Nepal is not isolated. It sits between India and China, two giants whose interests loom over every political move. Any instability risks drawing in influence from both sides, complicating Nepal's fragile democracy even further. So as the interim government takes its place, the question remains: will Nepal's leaders finally listen to the voices of the young? Or will history repeat itself, leaving Gen Z with nothing but ashes and anger? The answer may define not only Nepal's next election, but its future as a democracy. Nepal may be small in size, but its position makes it one of the most strategically important countries in South Asia. Landlocked between India and China, two giants with competing ambitions, Nepal has always been a careful balancer. But in times of crisis, balance becomes far harder to maintain. The September 2025 uprising was not just a domestic affair, it immediately raised alarms across the region. Both New Delhi and Beijing watched closely, worried not only about instability spilling across borders, but also about who would shape Nepal's future. For India, Nepal is more than just a neighbor, it's family. Open borders allow millions of Nepalis to live and work in India. The countries share deep cultural, historical, and religious ties. But they also share disputes, from border tensions to water rights to growing mistrust of Indian interference. The protests, especially with their anti-elite and anti-corruption tone, worried Indian policymakers.
Why?
Because a youth-driven uprising in Nepal could inspire similar sentiments across the region, where many young people face the same frustrations: corruption, unemployment, and broken promises. New Delhi's immediate concern was security. Curbing migration surges, preventing instability from spilling into the border states, and making sure Nepal does not tilt toward Beijing in the aftermath. For China, Nepal is a strategic bridge for its Belt and Road Initiative. Beijing has invested in roads, hydropower, and infrastructure projects inside Nepal. It views stability as essential to keeping those investments secure. But China also fears that democratic uprisings, even across the Himalayas, could embolden movements in its own restive regions. In the weeks following the protests, Chinese state media framed the unrest not as a democratic awakening, but as chaos fueled by corruption and foreign influence. Beijing signaled it would support any government in Kathmandu that promised order, even if that meant favoring security over democracy. For both powers, the key question is, who will win the loyalty of Nepal's next generation? India has the advantage of cultural closeness and open migration. China has the advantage of big investments and promises of fast development. But Gen Z in Nepal is increasingly skeptical of both. They want sovereignty, independence, and a government that answers to them, not to foreign capitals. Beyond the region, the United States and European Union also issued statements after the protests. While limited in direct influence, Western governments framed the uprising as a test case for democracy in South Asia. NGOs and human rights groups quickly mobilized to monitor arrests, internet blackouts, and the treatment of protesters. This international attention puts pressure on Nepal's interim government. Too much tilt toward India risks upsetting China. Too much reliance on China risks alienating India. And appearing too cozy with either risks alienating Nepali youth, who increasingly demand neutrality and self-determination. In this sense, Nepal's crisis is not just about politics, it's about geopolitics. It's about whether a small nation can remain truly independent in the shadow of giants. But here lies the paradox. The very instability that terrifies Nepal's neighbors is also what gives its youth leverage. If India and China want stability, they cannot ignore the demands of Gen Z. If the international community wants Nepal to remain democratic, it must support reforms, not just elections. The protests of September 2025 were therefore more than an internal revolt. They were a message to the world. Nepal's youth will not quietly accept being a pawn on someone else's chessboard. They are demanding a seat at the table, nationally and globally. And the world, whether ready or not, will have to listen. So, what comes next for Nepal? The uprising has shaken the foundations, but the future is still unwritten. 3 possible paths lie ahead, and each depends on choices made in the months leading up to the 2026 elections. Scenario 1. Renewal. In this future, the interim government succeeds in restoring stability. The March 5th elections are held fairly, with record youth turnout. New leaders, possibly even entirely new parties, emerge, propelled by Gen Z's momentum. Corruption investigations move forward. Institutions, though damaged, begin to rebuild credibility. The Supreme Court is restored, the parliament reopens, and political elites are forced to adapt to a new reality: accountability. This path is not easy, but it offers hope. It would mean Nepal finally breaks free from its cycle of instability and moves closer to the democracy its people have long demanded. Scenario 2. Stalemate. Here, elections are held, but the results reproduce the same old patterns. Traditional parties dominate. Youth movements fracture without clear leadership. Anger simmers, but it does not translate into structural reform. Corruption cases stall once again. International actors, India, China, the US, continue their tug-of-war, while ordinary Nepalis lose faith. In this version of the future, the uprising becomes just another chapter in Nepal's long history of unrest. Loud, fiery, but ultimately absorbed by the system. Scenario 3. Regression. This is the darkest path. Political paralysis deepens, protests reignite, and security forces respond with harsher crackdowns. Public trust collapses entirely. In desperation, leaders may turn to authoritarian measures, extending emergency powers, postponing elections, even flirting with military influence in governance. This path risks undoing decades of democratic struggle, returning Nepal to a time when the people's voice was silenced. It would also invite greater foreign interference, as both India and China seek to fill the vacuum left by failing institutions. Which path Nepal takes will depend on 2 forces: the determination of Gen Z to stay engaged beyond the streets, and the willingness of political elites to finally listen. The next months are crucial. The March 2026 elections will not just decide who governs, they will decide whether Nepal's democracy survives. For ordinary Nepalis, the stakes are deeply personal. Will they be forced to send yet another generation abroad for survival? Or will the youth finally have reasons to stay, build, and believe in their own country? For the region, the stakes are strategic. Can Nepal remain sovereign, or will it be pulled too tightly into India's orbit or China's embrace? And for the world, the stakes are symbolic. Nepal is a test case for what happens when Gen Z rises, not in a superpower, but in a small, vulnerable democracy. Does the system adapt and reform, or does it collapse under the pressure? The answer will shape not just Nepal's destiny, but the story of youth movements in the 21st century. The road ahead is uncertain, but one thing is clear: the youth of Nepal have spoken. And once a generation finds its voice, it cannot be silenced. Nepal's September 2025 uprising was not just another protest. It was a turning point, a moment when a new generation stood up and said, "Enough." They lit fires not just in the streets of Kathmandu, but in the hearts of millions who have long waited for change. Their courage carried a message that echoed across mountains, across borders, and across the world. Democracy only survives if people are willing to fight for it. The costs have been devastating. Dozens dead, buildings destroyed, and institutions scarred. But history shows that out of tragedy can come transformation. If Nepal's leaders listen, if they reform, if they give space to this generation, the uprising could be remembered not for its flames, but for its rebirth. If they do not, the story will not end here. Gen Z has already shown it is unafraid to return to the streets. And once a generation discovers its collective power, there is no going back. Nepal today is a warning and an inspiration. A warning to leaders who think corruption and neglect can go unpunished. And an inspiration to young people everywhere who wonder if their voices matter. They do. In Nepal, they already have. As the world watches, one question remains: what will you do with this story? Will you just watch from a distance, or will you carry its lessons forward? Because whether you live in Kathmandu, New York, London, or Sydney, the fight for accountability, transparency, and justice is universal. Nepal's Gen Z is not alone. They are part of a global generation demanding a future worth living. And that's where you come in. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, if you believe young voices deserve to be heard, then don't let this video end here. Share it. Discuss it. Add your voice in the comments. What do you think Nepal's future should look like? Renewal, stalemate, or regression? And if you want to stay informed about global movements, uprisings, and the struggles shaping our world, make sure you subscribe. Because this story is not over. In March 2026, Nepal will face the most important election in its modern history. And we'll be here to cover every step of it. Until then, remember this: power does not belong only to those in palaces or parliaments. It belongs to the people, especially those brave enough to claim it. From the Himalayas to the streets of Kathmandu, the youth of Nepal have already shown the way. The question now is whether the world is ready to follow.